Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Psychocinematic. Today we are covering The Invitation, directed by Jessica Thompson. And as always, spoilers ahead. So first I got to address the fact that this is episode 17 of this podcast, and yet this is the second movie called The Invitation that I'm covering. Now normally the titles that are The Blank, The House on the Hill, or whatever it is fine. And a lot of these movies in this category of psychological thriller are named that way. Over half the movies I believe that I've covered on this podcast are The Blank, but maybe movies need more creative titles. I mean, there's a million other things they could have named this movie. And an example of a creative title, there's that one exorcism movie coming out really soon. They could have easily called it Let Me In, because in the trailer, they say Let Me In at least twice, or at least the demon says it. But what they called this movie was Pray for the Devil, and not pray for the devil, but like the devil's prey. And that's pretty creative, I think. Anyways, the other thing that I gotta say before we get into the meat of this movie, if you've been following this podcast, then you would remember during the episode where I covered the movie Fresh, I said this: but if I had to go the rest of my life without another vampire or werewolf movie, I would be fine. I would actually probably prefer it. Yeah. That didn't age very well, but this vampire movie is an exception. When I watched the trailer, I was like, that actually looks like something that I would be interested in. I'm tired of the cliche vampire thing that's completely played out. I don't give a fuck about vampires, honestly. I don't. But I actually like this movie. So the movie starts off with one of the brides killing herself because she doesn't want to feed on the help. And then it takes us to New York, where we're following Evie, and she is working as the help. She's working for a catering company, and they're doing this DNA test event for a bunch of rich people. This immediately made me wonder if this whole DNA test company is run by vampires or by people who are under the authority of a vampire because they want to find that perfect bride. I was talking to my wife, who is the vampire expert. I just had to double check some of the lore throughout the movie with her to see if it checks out. And that is something that they like to do, is go for a relative. I believe they did that in Dracula. And if it isn't run by a vampire or under the authority of one, then it could just be one giant stroke of luck that Evie used the DNA test and then Walt found her. Stroke of luck for Walt. So Evie's friend steals some swag bags, which leads me to the joke moral of the story at the very beginning of this movie, which is, if you're a vendor working an event, maybe just steer clear of the swag bags, I mean, seriously, right there, this movie could have just gone nowhere had that friend just called out sick or just went home early. And now, since we're talking about Evie's friend, gotta mention how spot on she is about pretty much everything she says in this movie. She says things like, this DNA company probably wants to add you to the roster. They probably just want your kidneys, and it's an organ donor website. And then at the very end of the movie, when they show back up in England, she has a baseball bat and makes the comment about, oh yeah, it's funny that it's a bat, right? Like, she's just on point constantly. And then that makes me think too that this movie is really like Get Out meets Dracula. And now it may not be as good as Get Out, but they have some similar motifs throughout. Like, they've got the friend who is spot on the entire time, who's just looking out for her friend's safety and is used for occasional comedic relief, a family with ill intentions who is bringing a woman into their fold, and then also everyone is in on it, very much like Get Out. So then Evie goes to lunch with cousin Oliver, and he makes the comment that Grandpa is literally dying to meet you, which we all should know what that means. Also, this probably should have been a red flag for Evie, but like, they had barely sat down for lunch and Oliver's already offering to pay for a trip for her to go to England for this wedding. And it's just like, I don't care if you're family or not. I don't know you. So why would I trust you? I thought it was funny that the last name of Walter is DeVille, like devil. I thought that was pretty good. Now we finally meet Walter, and I've got to say, I'm happily married to my wife, but this actor is so fucking handsome. It's really not even fair. He's so handsome that it makes you feel uncomfortable just looking at him. Let me know in the comments if you agree. When we meet Walter, though, he's out in the daylight, and so I started thinking maybe he's not a vampire yet. Maybe they get turned together, and that's the whole point of this wedding. But I consulted my vampire expert wife, and she was saying that vampires can go out in the daylight typically with traditional lore if they are very powerful in that moment, or if it's overcast. I also took a second to write down that it's interesting that the vampire invites her into his home, because there's that whole rule that a vampire can't come into your home unless you invite them in. And so I just thought it was funny. They flipped it around. Then this house conveniently has no mirrors because they're being replaced. And then Evie talks to her friend on FaceTime and makes the comment that, yeah, him being a lord, you would expect him to be like 100 years old, but he's our age. Well, you'll find out. You'll find out why. When she wraps up that phone call, she says she's going to go for a jog. It's pitch black in a place that you've never been. Why do characters do this in movies? I would wait till the morning for sure. And so she goes for that jog. It's really funny how they showed it, because she finishes the jog in front of the mansion or manor, whatever you want to call it, but it literally looks like she just ran 100 feet from the building. So I thought that was funny. Now we've reached a point in the movie where one of the maids is going to be fed to the vampire. So what I found interesting about this is I thought, when we were first introduced to the maids, and based on how they were portrayed in the preview, I thought that they were all in on it, like they knew what their fate was and they just had no way of escaping it, or that they were happy to be a sacrifice. But clearly they did not know, and I thought that was interesting. And when the vampire goes to feed on this maid, he flips off the lights and turns on the record player, and I was thinking, is this the equivalent of me when I go and eat a meal by myself? I get comfortable and then I put on YouTube and just enjoy the meal. That's probably what it is. Also, a little side note, this movie has more jump scares than most of the movies I've covered on this podcast. One of them, I accidentally snapped the lead on my pencil while taking notes because I was not expecting to jump at that moment. Now, during the rehearsal dinner scene, the butler's doing the announcements when people are entering the party, and I couldn't help but think about that episode of The Office where Jim writes a book about hosting an elegant party and then, sells it to Dwight secretly. And then he ends up announcing people as they come into the party. Thought that was funny. Couple more red flags. Lucy didn't know what Evie was talking about when she was referring to the bride. And then also Walt says that he has no redeeming qualities. Evie gets visited by a ghost for a second time and she's hiding under her bed. And then Walt comes and drags her out from under the bed. And she's so thankful he's there, but doesn't ask a single question as to what are you doing here? How did you know I was in trouble? Anything like that. She then confronts Walt about the papers that she found that are all about her, and they kiss and make up, and he proposes that they get married, and she jokingly agrees, which is enough for him. So the next day at dinner, Walt announces they're getting married. She's going to be the third bride. Everyone in the room is in on it, and they're mortal, and they have all stuck together for generations for power and strength. And then later on, Evie ends up escaping this property because she doesn't want to get married, and she goes and knocks on someone's door in town, and I totally knew these people were going to be in on it. There's no way. So Walt probably has authority over that whole town, would be my guess. So now we've reached the end of the movie where Evie gets turned, she stabs Walt, Lucy goes after Victoria, they both get impaled, and I start realizing that, man, it is negligent how many things there are in a vampire's house that they can be impaled on. You would think that if you had eternal life except for a couple asterisks, you would take care of those loose ends and, maybe baby-proof your house. No sharp edges. Also, when the butler is trying to impale Evie, the fact that she's struggling to overpower him, but she's a vampire, that kind of bothered me. Because aren't vampires supposed to be super strong? I forgot to ask my wife about this, and maybe there's some stupid thing in the lore where it's they're not super strong at first. I don't know. But I thought that was kind of dumb. Walter comes back for one last hurrah, and she uses that little clay cutting tool, which I totally knew was going to come in handy. It looks way too weapon-like to not be used against someone in this movie. And then finally, Evie turns back to a human, and then, like I had said earlier, comes back for Cousin Oliver. Now, today is the release date of The Invitation, and Rotten Tomatoes, as a collective, is just not a fan of this movie. The critics have given it 30%, and the audience have given it 53%. And where I stand, I'm a 7 out of 10, so 70%. I never really quite understood why people are so harsh on movies, because I enjoy most movies, and on this podcast, I've tended to cover movies that I think I will like or movies that I do like and I rewatch for the sake of this podcast. And part of the reason I enjoy most of these movies is because I really love this genre of psychological thrillers. I feel like it's the best genre of movie because it forces you to think more and they really pack in a ton of symbolism and you might even get scared in the process. Now, if this was a Marvel movie podcast, then sure, I'd be dishing out 3 out of 10s left and right because I fucking hate Marvel. Now, this movie seemed like the same but different approach to vampires, which I really enjoyed. You take vampires and the lore behind them and then you pack it into a horror thriller. I'm used to Twilight, lovey-dovey, also let's throw in some freaking werewolves, it's action-packed, or I'm used to the vampire slayers. What I'm not used to is a woman taking a DNA test and meeting a relative who tells her about a fake wedding and then going there under the guise of meeting all the family and then it turns out she's the one getting married. I'm not used to that. That is a nice approach. Now, I will say that the movie did seem better based on the trailer because it looked like there was going to be more mystery and more conspiracy throughout. I think this movie would have been a whole lot better if the trailer never revealed that it's for sure vampires. And I think this movie would have been better off had they not shown the bride killing herself in the beginning. That way, we can follow this movie in Evie's footsteps, trying to figure out exactly what is happening rather than telling the audience that it is for sure vampires. Imagine Evie shows up to this place for this wedding and then all of her relatives start seeming really creepy more and more, and then all of a sudden shit hits the fan. We see now that they're vampires and then the movie finishes from there. That's the movie I wanted to see. And even though that's not what we got, I still enjoyed it, so 7 out of 10. All right, that's all I have for you guys today on the movie The Invitation. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. If you did, leave me a thumbs up, comment which thought down below, and then don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.